Well, welcome to our fourth session in this series. And in this session we consider the desert and the dark. And one of the great things the desert teaches us is that while we are alone, we're not alone. So once again, let's take a moment to be quiet together, you in your space and time and me in mine, and to recognize that we are one. May God give us the grace to speak and to hear one or two honest words. Amen. In turning to speak of the desert and the dark, I'm very specifically turning to speak of that which really can't be spoken of. There's an old saying that you may well be familiar with, that those who know do not speak and those who speak do not know. So with that disclaimer, I boldly go ahead to speak. But it seems there is a need to say something that our minds can grasp as we move deeper into the Christian life, into the spiritual life, and deeper into our experiences as gay and lesbian people. As we were saying in our last session, Exodus and Awakening, as we come out of the sense of slavery into freedom, there's often a great sense of life and of joy, of a new juice, of a new possibility for being someone that I've always wanted to be, for having the freedom that I've always sought. I've finally arrived, I'm finally here. Tambourines and songs and things in the story of Exodus. But it doesn't take very long at all before we start to feel the chafe, before we start to feel, hey, this is not all so sweet out there. And even in here, there's desert territory involved in this journey. And that's what we want to talk about today. I know a number of years ago, when I first left high school, I joined the Franciscan order. And as novices, we go through a beautiful ceremony called clothing, when we kneel before the priest who's in charge of the province and say certain things, and he receives us into the order. And then we were wearing suits and ties, and we take off our jacket, or we help to take off our jacket, and then he puts the habit, the brown habit with the cord, on the hood, over us. And it's a very beautiful moment. And I remember after Mass was over, there were 7 of us, 7 very attractive young men, and all in our brown habits, and we went out into the sacristy and immediately reached for our jackets and took them with us as we went out the door. And the symbol of the habit, of course, is being clothed with the new person, comes from St. Paul, rather than the old person, slave to sin and all that kind of imagery. And one of the priests sort of looked at us and said, doesn't take long for the old man to reassert his rights, does it? As we went out with our jackets. And we just wanted to keep our jackets, basically, but there's a lot of truth in that we can have this honeymoon period, but it doesn't take very long before we start to realize what may be involved in the journey that we've undertaken, and that can come as a rude shock. So we start to enter a time of, I suppose, purification, of genuineness, where this is not just an experience, it's a life that we're living. So after the first flush of spiritual joy, we have aridity. After the coming out, we have the reality of what that means in our lives and our relationships. I remember when I was going through this process myself of discerning around coming out very publicly in a newspaper article. And a friend of mine who's a married woman, Judy, a very beautiful woman, was helping me discern, was this the time and the place and the way? And she said to me at one point, are you prepared for the hate? And it really took me aback, knocked me over a bit. And I really had to say no. I'm honestly not. I'm prepared for some opposition, some difficulty, but I wasn't really prepared for hate. That was one of my desert moments. It started to make me realise just what might be involved in living this life as an openly gay man. This is not a game. This is not a thrill. This is not opening night, the opera. This is a hard and long and wonderful journey that will take us into the deepest places and into the heights if we're prepared to go with it all the way. It really is, I believe, a way to true sanctification, true holiness, true maturity as a human being, if we are prepared to let it be that for us. There's a good old quote I'd like to read from one of J.D. Salinger's novel. He's the guy who wrote Catcher in the Rye. I don't want you to go away with the impression that there's any, inconveniences involved in the religious life. I mean, a lot of people don't take it up just because they think it's going to involve a certain amount of nasty application and perseverance. You know what I mean? As soon as we get out of chapel here, I hope you'll accept a little volume from me that I've always admired, called God is My Hobby. Well, the reality is that in this journey, it's not about a hobby. It's not about games. It's not about temporary excitement. It's about the day-by-day reality of living with all its beauty, its drudgery, its boredom, its pain, its joy. So, the desert. Why would I call this talk The Desert and the Dark? Well, first of all, because following our story of Exodus, and also the story of Jesus to a large extent, and certainly the story of the desert monks in our Christian spiritual heritage, the desert is moot. It's very much the point. Exodus does not lead the chosen people, the people of Israel, through the waters into, the great malls of Palestine, or the great shopping centres, or the entertainment sort of centres, the broadways of Israel. It leads them straight into a desert, and a very harsh desert at that. And in the tradition, in the story, they wandered in that desert for 40 years. This was a long time. And again, in the actual story, none of the people who came out of Egypt actually ended up coming out of the desert. There's a whole generation that changed in that story. It's a long and hard road. It's a long and hard road, and this is the story of Exodus. So, Israel in the desert, Christ in the desert, monks in the desert. What is the desert? When I was a little younger, I used to take groups of students on bus tours in the Australian outback. Now, probably some of the people watching have seen the bus tour to end all bus tours in the outback, namely Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. Unfortunately, we didn't run into Priscilla or her kind while we were traversing the wastelands. But certainly I got to know the beauty and the awesomeness of the Australian desert. Huge, enormous, the driest continent on Earth, the most desolate continent on Earth, apart from Antarctica. And in 13 or so trips around this vast wilderness, I got to sort of understand a bit about what the Israelites and what the desert monks might have experienced. I remember we pulled off the road as we would normally do in the middle of hundreds of miles of just absolute barren wasteland, with nothing between you and the west coast. We're up from Perth there, all that desolation, all that aridity, all that emptiness, and we're in the centre, and there's nothing between you and the ocean. And we pulled off the road, and the bus, stopped, and we made lunch and prepared sandwiches. And I went for a little walk up the road and climbed a little mound, and I looked out on this spectacular emptiness. And I saw this tin canister called a bus, and these 45 or so people milling around having sandwiches and drinks and things. And it seemed to me like we were a tiny ship in an immense and hostile ocean. And the only thing that was keeping us alive was staying with that ship. And if that ship were to break down or to move out into the wasteland and not stay on this road, this dirt track, get lost, we would die. Was that real? They call that country 6-hour country, saying that if you were caught there without shade and without water, you would die in 6 hours. This is very, very hostile country. This is the desert. So, what does going out into the desert teach us? Why would a person do this? And as we say, the Hebrews were led out there, the desert monks went there by choice. Christ went into the desert before he began his ministry. Why? Firstly, the desert teaches us a great intimacy with nature. We really are exposed in very raw ways to the beauty and the grandeur and the awesomeness of nature. We also feel the artificiality of our own lives. So much of civilization and the junk we carry around is stripped from us very readily in the desert. We start to realize just how fake it all is. Part of the reason that so much of what we carry with us from civilization appears so fake and even ridiculous when we are in the desert is that our real needs become very, very sharp and clear. You know, we often do these exercises around what are our wants and what are our needs. Well, you know, when you're in the desert, your real needs become very, very clear. Food, because of the experience of hunger. Water, because of the experience of thirst. Shelter, because of the experience of exposure to intense heat and intense cold. And companionship, because of the experience of loneliness. We really are reduced, in the good sense, to our basic humanness. And friends, there is no true spiritual life, there is no true life without coming down to our true humanness, our natural selves, and getting rid of some of the baggage, all of the baggage. We also become very aware in the desert of our dependency on each other, on nature to be kind to us and provide for us food and shelter, and on God, the universe, life. And in this connection we become very aware of how small we are, how fragile we are, and how awesome, how beyond our control the universe is. You know, I'm convinced that that primal experience was what gave rise to people offering sacrifice, for example, to try to placate the gods and to get them to be kind to them, because they experienced firsthand the awesomeness, the overwhelming majesty and uncontrollability of the universe, because they lived very simply in nature. Also in the desert, our demons are exposed. You can't play games with yourself in the desert, or if you do, very soon they'll fall apart. You get to know what your compulsions are, what your real motivations are, what your dark places are, what your fears are, what your addictions are, what your mess is. It becomes very clear. Our justifications, the way we make our life feel worthwhile, the way we make ourselves feel important, the way we give ourselves a sense of identity, the way we give ourselves, construct for ourselves a sense of identity, becomes very clear in the desert, and it becomes very empty in the desert, as again we become reduced to who we really are. So we get stripped down to this bare essential me in front of the awesomeness of what actually is. And we discover what it is we truly believe in, what it is we truly value, both what it is that we've been using as gods up until now, and when they're stripped away, and the sooner the better, what we then are left with, what we then find we really believe in. And in this experience, most of the authorities that we may have looked to for definition, for codes of morality or law, or for a sense of self, are also exposed as empty and pretty much as worthless. And all we are left with is, what is the law in my heart? What are my true values? What do I really believe matters? Now in this, some of the heritage of the past, some of what our community may have given to us, well, all of it is put to a very severe test. And in that test, some of it may come out as being worth something, but a lot of it will come out as being worth nothing. And in fact, as being an obstruction to coming into truth, to coming into who we are and what we really believe. A friend of mine, a gay priest who recently left a religious order in Australia, painfully had to say that he really felt the other side of it, that a lot of what was structured for him in fact kept him away from living a deeply spiritual life. But he had to go through a desert of loneliness and of emptiness to find that. So in this desert, the authorities we've looked to, including our society, including gay culture, and we'll consider that a little later, are really put to the test. And those that survive, survive, and those that don't were never worth it in the first place. So this is why the desert has traditionally been seen as a place of purification and a place of deep growth. Now, Meister Eckhart, one of our great mystics, says the soul grows by a process of subtraction. We take away the junk, in a sense, and not just the junk in sometimes stuff that seems quite worthwhile has to go as well, so that we can't become stripped down to who we are at bottom, the absolute ground of who we are. And in this process we become open to God. We also become open to the experience of, I guess, the devil or the demons within ourselves. A very harrowing experience. It is the place of struggle. I would like to look at the experience of Jesus when he goes into the desert before he begins his ministry and experiences temptation. And we'll also look at the experience of Israel, because for them the desert is a place of regret, a place of challenge, of temptation, of betrayal, of covenant, of becoming a people, of aimless wandering, and ultimately of the journey to the promised land. So let's keep these two paradigms in mind as we look briefly first at the experience of gay people in our culture. So as I was saying earlier, after coming out we very quickly begin to experience the cost. After the joy and delight, we have to face the fact that our jobs could be at stake, our friendships can be at stake. Many people find in this experience who truly loves them for who they are and who can't cope with this new supposed revelation. Very much our families. I mean, we all know this. The incredible traumas and struggle and pain that so many thousands and thousands of gay people go through every day, every year in coming out to their families. So many people say, I have never done anything harder in my life. And the risk that is involved so often, and so often the rejection. I'm sure we all have close friends, or if we haven't experienced it ourselves, who have been really totally rejected by their families and don't hear from them for years, if at all. Tremendous pain, tremendous sense of loss and of alienation. The sense of the church rejecting us, of not wanting us to be part of its life. And of course the risk to our own lives themselves in a very physical sense. These dimensions strip us down, these dimensions of the desert, strip us back if we're open to them and we don't take refuge in panaceas and placebos and quick answers. They strip us back to our basic selves and ask us, what really is worthwhile? What do I really believe in? What really matters? Who really are my gods? And who is with me in this journey, in this struggle, and who is not? It's a real process of hollowing out, of sifting the wheat and the chaff and finding out what really stays there. And in this process, there also can be days of great regret, of thinking, what the hell have I done? Of thinking I should go back, of hearing voices calling me back. Am I mad that I could think I could really live out here? We start to taste the exile, to really taste it. Before we kind of knew it was there and we were frightened of it, but now we're eating it and drinking it. We are tasting it in all its bitterness, in all its reality, the exile. The sense of being an outsider, of not belonging, of being excluded, the stigma. We feel it every time whether we question ourselves as to whether we should come out to someone or not, and we do that almost every time we meet someone. We experience it every time someone mentions the word gay or lesbian, and we feel something rise in us, something that both wants to cover over and protect ourselves, and something that wants to strike out and make a statement. And which do I do here? Again, we feel the chafe, we feel the rub, we feel the exile, that we don't belong. We often feel it when we watch families and children. So many of us feel excluded from that, even those of us who have had children, be they in gay relationships or children from past marriages, still feel that we are in some way excluded from the fullness of family life in our society. And we feel that pain when we see children and families together. This is very real. It's a day-by-day experience. You know, I said in the last tape, perhaps somewhat playfully, that not all of us live in the Castro. And even in the Castro we feel this. So how much more in so many other cities all around the world? This constant day-by-day experience of exile. This is the experience of desert, of being outside of society, outside of the mainstream. Whatever jobs we may hold, however much we may go to work in suits and ties, we don't belong. We feel our dependence. Like in the desert, we feel our dependence on others. It's a painful reality, but you know, as John Boswell points out through his book about social tolerance, that fundamentally we have our place in the society at the mercy of the majority. Even if there are 10% of us, there are 90% of them, and they've got the structures on their side. In the place where we're filming now, there is a rainbow flag in the window. I've often thought as I've come in this place, it would just take a breath of change, just a soft breeze of change, and we would have to take that flag out because it would no longer be safe to have it in the window. I have bumper stickers on my car. So far the windshield has not been smashed, but it could be. Again, just a breath of change, and it certainly would be. Now this has been the reality of gay people's lives all through history. Even when we have situations such as in the Native American tribes, when gay people are honoured, the fact remains that that could change. Being honoured and being reviled are two sides of the same coin. What's being said is these people are different, these people are special. One is saying they have a unique and gifted role, and the other is saying they're scum, they're the dregs. They really are two sides of the same coin. They're saying that we are on the outside. By the will of the majority, we may be brought inside, but it remains by the will of the majority. This is not an easy thing to hear. This is not an easy thing to face. In no sense am I ever suggesting that we do not fight for our rights. In fact, this is more reason to fight for our rights. Accepting this reality, at the very least, folks, it's not going to happen in our lifetime. And we know it could change. It could change. Whatever rights we win can be reversed. They have been before. So experiencing this reality that we are desert travellers, we are outside the mainstream. We do hold our rights and our freedoms to some degree dependent on the majority, feeling the rub of the exclusion, the pain of the exclusion. This is what it means to be in the desert. Being exposed to what our real gods are. This is what it means to be in the desert. Again, there's a very physical dimension to the desert, and there is a very physical dimension to this. It comes down to jobs, employment, housing, fundamental rights, life itself. Again, this is not a game, this is not just a spiritual state. This is a physical fact, as the desert is a physical fact. And we also, in this desert, we feel the need for companionship, for support, on a much, much deeper level. So if we think for a moment about that image of the metal canister, the bus in that vast Australian outback, that need for, that issue of survival, that outside of this canister we couldn't have survived. But part of what was happening in that canister was that people were coming together to support one another, feed one another, share with one another, and journey through the desert together. And in my experiences in Latin America, I've seen that also people who have made an exodus from the old regimes and are going through the desert of struggle and of liberation, of building a new society against incredible odds in places such as Nicaragua and El Salvador, that what they have is community. That is their gift, that is their blessing, and that is what they can teach us. This need for one another, to be with one another and to strengthen one another in this incredibly harrowing and painful and holy process of being stripped down to who I truly am. So one of the dangers in trying to look for companionship is that we can sort of grab for false solutions. We can look for some kind of companionship just to sort of help us ease the pain. And that is understandable, but ultimately it's a dead end and we need to be careful of it. It's also important, I think, as we go through the desert, and there's more to come, and the dark, is that we remember to celebrate our liberation and to enjoy what we have won, the freedoms we have won. Just last night, as I was coming home to prepare this session, I'd already done a lot of work and I wanted to go over it a little more. I was faced with the choice of being with some of my gay brothers in a very sensual and supportive way, or coming home and doing my work alone. And a friend said to me, no, you're going to be talking about liberation, exodus, and journeying through the desert. Come out and be with us and let us support you and celebrate the liberation you're going to be talking about. You know enough about the desert to talk about it already. So that's what I did, and I think that's precisely what we need to do as well as going through the desert. Face it, accept it, live it, be stripped, but also celebrate and nurture and share the joy of the liberation we're experiencing. That is what brings us manna in the desert, brings us food in the desert, and leads us through it. So in all of this, we experience temptations in this road through the wilderness. To go back. I've had enough of this, I'm going back. I'm going to go back and get the job with the corporation, put on the suit, do the thing, pretend to be the straight guy. It's not worth it. Denial. Well, it's not so bad. It's not so bad. I mean, the place I live's all right. My company's okay. My family's all right. It's not so bad. What's the problem? What's all this moaning and groaning about deserts for? It is so bad. This is classic denial. The setting up of ghettos. Not that having our own space is not a good idea. We have to watch they don't become ghettos. Keeping other people out and thinking we have solved the problem. Well, sorry, we haven't. Thirdly, to despair. The temptation to despair. It's hopeless, it's worthless, there's no way forward. And this brings to mind, of course, all the gay suicides that we're aware of. And if we're ever tempted to think it's not so bad, the desert is not so real, what's this guy going on about? Just think of our gay suicides. The heritage that we carry in our blood, of how many of our gay brothers and sisters still today kill themselves rather than face the reality of what it means to be gay in our culture. This is exile. This is the desert. This is the pain that we face. Can we walk through it together without denying it, without taking refuge in our old slavery, without finding false solutions, and without despairing? So I want to look at these temptations. In the story of Jesus going into the desert, he's tempted 3 times by the devil in the story in the Gospels, just before he begins his ministry. The first temptation in the desert is when the devil says to him, turn these stones into bread. In that temptation for us, I see the temptation for us to pretend to ourselves that the stones the church has handed us are in fact food. That the stones of self-hatred, the stones of it's okay to be gay but don't do anything about it, the stones of the old code of morality, in as much as it affects us, pretending that those stones actually do nourish us and the church really has good teaching there. It's a danger when we're feeling weak and vulnerable and lost to try to make these stones into bread. Secondly, the devil appears to Jesus and shows him all the kingdoms of the world. You'll remember our image of world from the last tape, the world as being the structures of the status quo, which keeps some people down and raises a few people up at their expense. And the devil says to Jesus, all these cities of the world can be yours if you'll fall down and worship me. And what I like to see in that is the temptation to materialism, to consumerism, to bowing down before the almighty dollar, whether it's pink or otherwise. There's also, I believe, a temptation to buy the values of the old culture in a new form, which are the values of much of the gay subculture, just in a new dress, in a new shape. It's one of the great dangers, that we get sucked into that, and in fact we are bowing down before the old gods. And sure, we can have all this, if that's what we want. And the third temptation The devil takes Jesus to the top of a high mountain and says to him, throw yourself down. It's written in Scripture that the angels will support you and you won't even dash your foot on a stone. Throw yourself down and see if God will come to your aid. And what I see here is the temptation for us to refuse to live the ordinary, boring, painful, hard life of faith as we go through the desert. To in some sense test God, try and force God to make it all okay, to fix it all, to make it so that we don't dash our foot on a stone. Come on, you said all these things, prove it to me. Instead of the hard, hidden road of faith, which is the true road through the desert, the true road through the dark, the true road into fullness of life. They're three of the temptations I believe we face as gay people, seen in the temptations of Jesus. When we look at the experience of Israel, we see a very, very powerful image. It wasn't long before the Hebrews got very tired of the desert and started thinking, at least in Egypt we had meat to eat and bread to eat and, we could sit around and relax a bit. And here, what have we got? Nothing much. And they also started to miss the gods of Egypt, because this God was a very hidden God, a God who had no image, had no real name. And the gods of Egypt, there was feasting and dancing, and at least you could focus on something. So while Moses was up on the mountain receiving the covenant, they put in all their gold and they melted it down and they made a golden calf, a false god, a new god, a god like they had in Egypt, and set it up on a pedestal and danced around it and had a great feast. And Moses comes down the mountain with the tablets of the law and is very upset and smashes the tablets. On goes the story. But the point is this dancing around the golden calf. They're in the desert. They've come through the Exodus. They've walked a fair way into the desert. And still they can make a golden calf. Now the golden calf was made with gold that they had plundered from the Egyptians and brought with them. So the golden calf is actually made out of gold from the old culture, gold from the old slavery, gold from the old structures of society. Now you might think I'm doing a number on gay subculture. Well, folks, I am. I think one of our great dangers is that we take the gold of the old culture and rework it into the golden calf. The golden calf of ageism and sexism and materialism and consumerism, mindless, absolutely mindless and heartless pleasure at the exploitation of other people. We use people, we use things, we use clothes, we use fashion, we use whatever it might be. We use ambition, we use, careers, we use one another as a god to stop the void, the pain of this hurting in the desert. And we think we've found something. We found less than nothing. We found just the old stuff in a new form, just as much slavery, if we are going to accept that the journey into true gay maturity is also the journey into true spiritual maturity. And that is what I'm proposing. So we have to break away from these gods, both within us or outside of us, because if we don't, they will keep reasserting themselves in new forms. And that is part of what has to happen in the desert. Finding the false gods and disposing of them, finding more and disposing of them, being constantly purged until we can find who we truly are. Again, there's no suggestion that we don't fight for our rights and that we don't set up enclaves where we feel safe. The danger is that we make them into the be-all and end-all and feel we've arrived in the promised land, when in fact we're just in a little oasis of exile. The journey through the desert can also lead us to bitterness and enslavement if we're not open to the possibilities of joy and the goodness of community, as I was speaking about before. Another experience of being in the desert, and this is a very important one, is the desert traveller can recognise other desert travellers, can be open to other poor, wandering nomads who roam the desert, kind of pushed out and rejected, and can learn the gift of hospitality, can learn the gift of solidarity, can learn the gift of being brother and sister for one another in oppression. And here I'm speaking not just of gay and lesbian people, but of all oppressed peoples. It may well be that our main struggle as gay and lesbian people is for our own rights. But at the same time, we need to recognise and support and welcome and affirm all the oppressed and marginalised groups in our society. And if our hearts aren't open to them, then again we're becoming closed off into our own world. The desert teaches us justice. It teaches us compassion, because we know what it's like to be in the desert. We know what it's like to be on the margins, to be excluded, to be outside, to be one of those on whose bodies the structures are built, which give privilege to a few and enslave the many. We know that. And so we can support and struggle with all of those who are oppressed and kept down. The desert, by the way, was the place where the monks learned hospitality. You may well be aware that one of the great gifts of monasticism was hospitality, that any traveller who turned up at the door had to be welcomed as if that person were Christ. The reason was that in the desert, your very life can depend on hospitality. How much we need to learn hospitality for one another as we struggle through this desert. Another great experience the desert teaches us is self-knowledge. In the midst of our loneliness and our fear and our uncertainty, as this baggage of the old self is being stripped away, we learn who we really are. And this is the first principle of the spiritual life, to know ourselves. We also know what we're capable of. To read you a brief quote from Dorothy Day when she was in prison. Dorothy Day, as you may well know, was a wonderful woman who died not so long ago at a good old age, who spent her whole life working for justice in places like the slums of Harlem. And she was thrown into jail for picketing with militant suffragists in 1918. And she writes, "The blackness of hell was all about me. The sorrows of the world encompassed me. I was like one gone down into a pit. Hope had forsaken me. I was that mother whose child had been raped and slain. I was the mother who had borne the monster who had done it. I was even that monster, feeling in my own heart every abomination." So in this experience, Dorothy Day learns tremendous compassion. She learns solidarity. She learns what she herself could be capable of in her own darkness. You don't get through the desert without facing our own demons. They're not all out there. They're also in here. And we have to face them as well. In fact, they're the ones we most need to face, and the ones most people are running away from at a great rate. The desert can invite us to meet them. And these folks are profound gifts. Hard gifts, but great gifts, true gifts, if we really want to grow into maturity, if we do. So we want to give thanks for the desert. We want to give thanks that we are treated as someone worthless and thrown away by mainstream society, because we can learn these gifts, which sooner or later everyone has to learn if they are going to grow to maturity, because these are part of the human condition. We have the gift of starting from that place where we can most easily learn them if we are open. As I say, painful gifts, but powerful gifts. John McNeill, a wonderful man, a wonderful priest who was expelled from the Jesuits a few years back for his long-term work with gay and lesbian people, makes the point very powerfully that there can't be any true gay spirituality unless we do embrace this experience of exile, because it's the truth. And you can't have a gay spirituality founded on anything but the truth. Now, as I say, this exile, Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor," because it opens us to what is in us and in other people. So we need to embrace it, accept it, affirm it. One of the alternatives to embracing our exile is to react to our stigma. Now, there's been a lot of work done on what it means to be stigmatized and on how different stigmatized groups react to stigma. One of the first ways is concealment. Now, we all know that. And as gay people, we can conceal it, unlike black people, if we want to. We can become militant. So we take up arms and become very, very powerful and strong and activist, I'm not saying that's bad, but I am saying we are still reacting from the experience of stigma. We can put down the people who stigmatize us. So we put down the straights, breeders. What would they know about how to dress? Look at that hideous shirt. We put them down. So we recognize that we're stigmatized, so we try and reach up and grab the 90% and push them down, stigmatize them. The corollary to that, of course, is boosting us. Gay people have the most elegant dinner parties. Gay people have the best taste. Gay people are the most creative people. Gay people are the most spiritual people. Gay people are where it's really at. We set all the trends, boosting us to make us feel better. And again, it's not that there may not be some truth in some of those things, right? But the thing is that we're reacting that way to make ourselves feel better because we're stigmatized. We're still reacting from stigma to stigma. The fifth way of reacting, and this is a very important one, is splitting the stigmatized group. So that we have been put down, now find someone else in our group who's stigmatized, who we can put down even further and stigmatize them. Classic example, I sat at a gay pride celebration one time with a beautiful young man, and when some leather men came near, he reacted incredibly to these leather guys. Oh, look at this, isn't it sick, isn't that pathetic, God, that makes me ill, I hate that. And I sat back and thought, mate, they're exactly the words that straight people use about us. Exactly the term, sick, ill, makes me disgusted, and exactly the tone. Splitting the stigmatized group and saying, well, I'm not so bad, at least I'm not that. Now, the leather guys might have done the same thing to him because he had been a prostitute. Now, they could easily have turned around and said, oh, at least we weren't prostitutes. Prostitutes could turn back and say, oh, yes, but we weren't drag queens. The drag queens turn around and say, well, at least we're not assimilationists. So each group is putting down the other, all reacting to stigma. Who wins in this? Not the stigmatized. If anyone wins, it's the mainstream which is doing the stigmatizing. And the final way of coping with stigma is to migrate, which is not totally different from concealment, the first method. And many of us have done that too, migrated in a hope of getting away from stigma. The reality, of course, the bad news, is you can't. We are stigmatized. Black people are stigmatized. Jews are stigmatized. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's there. What we can do is decide how we're going to cope with this. Are we going to accept the fact and face it in all its painfulness? Are we going to learn solidarity with other stigmatized groups? Are we going to learn the wonderful critique and freedom that it can offer us in relation to mainstream society? Are we going to learn the truth about human nature both within us and in other people that it can allow us to have? In other words, are we going to learn its lessons, or are we going to react and push it away from ourselves? I'm not an exile. I'm not a stigmatized person. Again, the invitation to accept the desert. I'd like to read from you something from W.H. Auden. In all of what I'm talking about, there is a kind of an encounter with death. The old self and many of the old hopes for self are dying, and we're facing that we cannot be those people anymore. Not only can we not be the people that our society would have us be, but we can't be the accepted and belonging type people, the people who make it that we might have hoped we could be. And that's a death. That's a very painful death. But it's the way to learn then who we can be, who we are. The desert is the place of, this is from a book by Alan Jones. The desert is the place of the encounter with death. It is also the place where we know ourselves to be truly free. We do not go into the desert in order to wall up our heart. We go there in order to give it away, to open it to God and to everyone. Auden says, The garden is the only place there is. The garden is the only place there is. But you will not find it until you have looked for it everywhere and found nowhere that is not a desert. To find the garden, Jones continues, to give one's heart away, to be free, one must enter the desert, stop the world, face death. Now the tears begin to flow. Yet these, it is promised, are also capable of being transformed into gifts. If we stay with the desert, if we remain on the journey, if we don't opt for false solutions or quick, easy communities, if we don't simply react against our stigma by pushing it away, but rather enter into it as our sacred wound and learn its lessons, what happens? What happens if you stay in the desert? Vulnerably, openly, trustingly. What happens is that you are led into the dark. Ultimately, we will be led through the dark into another phase of life. But first, we go deeper into the dark. Now, all of this experience of desert and darkness, which I'm going to talk about, is never absolute. There are always moments of light and joy and intimacy and freedom, and we need to celebrate that as well. Okay, this is not just a neurotic pathology I'm talking about, but it is something very real and very profound and quite painful. The dark becomes harder and harder to speak about, the more because in Western culture and in most of our Western religion, we have tended to focus on the light as the image that we use. When I speak about the dark in relation to spirituality, most people don't know what on earth I'm talking about, except, embracing the shadow, and that's not what I'm talking about. In fact, it's a very traditional, ancient, and mainstream theological teaching that all our words, all our images, all our concepts, all our scripture, everything that has ever been said or imaged about God is empty. That it only just escapes being a total lie. It's a finger pointing to the moon. It's a signpost into the mystery. But the signpost is not the mystery, and the finger is not the moon. And all of our words, all of our images, every concept ever thought about God, everything, every word of Scripture, is just a finger or a signpost. God is the mystery. And you must leave the finger and leave the signpost to go into the mystery. Into the darkness, into the absolute silence, into the nothingness of God. Now this is mainstream theological teaching, not heresy, not some reworking of Eastern teaching. This goes way, way back to the very earliest centuries of the church's life. And even in Exodus, in the story of Exodus, way back thousands of years ago, when Moses asks to see God, God hides him in the cleft of a rock, covers him with his hand, and says, "When I pass, you may look upon my back, because no man can see my face and live." Images of the dark, images of the inability to capture God by sight or by image or by concept. I'd like to read you a few quotes from some mystics. Language cannot do everything. Chalk it on the walls where the dead poets lie in their mausoleums, says Adrian Rich. Love winter when the plant says nothing, says Thomas Merton. This word is a hidden word and comes in the darkness of the night. To enter this darkness, put away all voices and sounds, all images and likenesses. For no image has ever reached into the soul's foundation, where God herself, with her own being, is effective. from Meister Eckhart. Then alone do we know God truly, when we believe that God is far beyond all we can possibly think about God. St. Thomas Aquinas. The ground of the soul, which for Eckhart is also the ground of God, is dark, says Eckhart. I said to my soul, be still, and let the dark come upon you, which shall be the darkness of God. T.S. Eliot. Yet no matter how deeply I go down into myself, my God is dark, and like a webbing made of 100 roots that drink in silence, says Rilke, the poet. Nothing in all creation is so like God as stillness. Eckhart. And again from Eckhart, perhaps the most searing of all, Eckhart says, I pray God to rid me of God. For God's unconditioned being is beyond God and all distinctions. And in fact, Eckhart talks about even the Father, Son, and Spirit being this side of that absolute unconditioned void, the wasteland, the ground, the darkness, which is the abyss, as he speaks of God, where not even the distinctions of Father, Son, and Spirit appear. The absolute unutterable mystery, which no eye has seen or ear has ever heard. Jesus simply says, no man, no one has seen the Father. The absolute mystery. And in this experience of going into the dark, which the desert, its most precious gift, gives us, we are being led into the dark, into the very mystery of God, if we are prepared to be open. And one of the reasons I'm speaking in these tapes is because too few of us know that this is the very road of Christian mysticism. This is the very heart of what it means to follow the full Christian spiritual journey, to be led through the desert into the absolute darkness. And we'll talk about what that means in relation to God and in relation to ourselves. Growth into this experience. How does one grow into this experience? Firstly, by following all of the gifts and the lessons that the desert has offered us, as we've talked about them. But secondly, and it's a very mysterious way, a very obscure way, it's very hard to know, and it's very hard to speak about any of these things. We're led by a way that is very strange and that we can't really chart or map ourselves. It too is dark. It can be very confusing, very upsetting. It shakes us up and breaks us apart because all that we've known has to be totally transformed. We're coming into the real transformation of the human person here. Our meaning is being literally deconstructed, taken apart bit by bit. It's not just us, not just the self, which has to be totally stripped away into our absolute foundation of darkness. It's also God. God, as we have conceptualized God, has to be broken apart because that is not God. So deconstructing the desert also has to be applied, has to do its work on God. This process, St. John of the Cross, one of the greatest mystics of all time, probably the classic formulation of this way, says, and I'll read this in full, to come to what you do not know, you must go by a way you do not know. To come to what you do not enjoy, you must go through where you do not enjoy. To come to what you do not possess, you must go through where you do not possess. To come to what you are not, you must go through where you are not. If you wish to be all, wish to be nothing in anything, If you wish to know all, wish to know nothing of anything. If you wish to enjoy all, wish to possess nothing of anything. Nothing, nothing, nothing. And even on the mountain, nothing. T.H. Lawrence says it perhaps a little more easily for us, though no less searingly. Are you willing to be sponged out, erased, cancelled, made nothing? Are you willing to be made nothing, dipped into oblivion? If not, you will never really change. Because the you that I have known, if I'm going to really change, that you has to break apart, has to become nothing. So that the true ground, the true self, the true who I am, the true name that I have in the mystery of God, which I don't know, which no mouth has ever spoken or could speak, that true name can only be found underneath, beyond, deeper than all the names and words and sounds and images. And the way to that is through them all, as they all fall away, become empty, become dust and ashes in our mouth. This is not an easy path. This is the deeper part of the desert. You note that I was saying this has to happen as well to God as we have understood God, to the God of our fathers, to the God of our church. And that's the most painful part of all. Simone Weil, who was a wonderful Jewish Christian mystic earlier this century, said there are two atheisms, of which one is a purification of the notion of God. But, folks, it's experienced as an atheism. It's experienced often in the spirit, in the soul, in the bones, as if I no longer believe in God. This is what is happening to the mind. It's all falling apart. It's falling away. And we don't know what is happening to us. The more so because we felt we were being faithful and walking on the road as faithfully as we could, learning the lessons of the desert, accepting our exile, becoming nothing, having the old gods and structures stripped away, and becoming mature gay and lesbian people, and now we're thrust into this darkness, and what the hell has happened? And that again is why I speak. That is why John of the Cross wrote, to say, this is what may be happening, have a look. Of course, this doesn't happen all at once. For some people, there are defining moments where they can say it's begun. I can remember myself for a moment after a very profound experience where I really felt my life was on the line, in jeopardy, my sanity, my spirituality, and I felt that God had absolutely betrayed me, had led me into this trick and betrayed me. And I came through that and found trust again. And it was after that that suddenly God disappeared. And all that was left was absolute absence. And I was still teaching at that point, and I remember teaching a religious education class to 18-year-olds. And when someone spoke the word God, it was as if my whole guts looked up and said, but where? As if I was looking out the window on the road for God. This experience of absolute absence when it begins to fall away. And the message of people like John of the Cross is, yes, this is what has to happen. Stay with this. Stay with this. Don't run from it. Of course, this goes contrary to what most people expect about what the spiritual life should be like. You know, it should be more and more light, more and more joy, more and more feeling together, feeling integrated, feeling good about myself. It's the opposite of what we tend to expect. And that expectation adds to our sense of confusion, lostness, and loneliness. We don't feel as if other people can understand us. It also goes contrary to a lot of what New Age teaching tends to be saying. Not all of it, but some of it. And to that extent, I'd say it's definitely missing the boat. It's missing the boat. It's also something that not many people inside or outside the church really want. And frankly, who can blame them? Who can blame them? It is, however, the holy road of purification. It's not always felt like that. It's felt as very bewildering and frightening at times. And yet there is often a deep sense of assurance. This is the only way forward through this, not around it, not past it. So, I want you to listen to these words as a gay or lesbian person. All our old structures fall apart. Society, family, church, our sense of self, who we thought we were, our morality, our moral code, what we thought was right and wrong begins to fall apart. Religious rituals become empty, become meaningless, often routine, painful to experience. We feel as if we're an outsider. We feel as if we're excluded from them. We see our own compulsions, our own weakness, our own hypocrisy. We feel our need, our powerlessness, our dependency on others, and we feel as if we're losing control of ourselves and our life. Religious language and God language becomes empty and meaningless. Empty, empty, empty. It seems to say almost nothing if it says anything at all. God seems to disappear. Certainly the God we have known disappears, and we can't find any sense of a God to be with us in this experience of being gay and lesbian. There's a sense we've been betrayed by this God, the God we learned as a child, perhaps the God we loved for many years. A deep sense of loss, almost despair around losing this God. We feel like we've been taken out of life, as if we no longer belong, as if our life in some way is over. There's no future for me. It's finished. We might as well close up shop and maybe start the whole thing again. It's hopeless. Emptiness, meaninglessness, aimlessness, almost despair. And yet one continues on. Thomas Merton made a comment about why do we continue on in the midst of this. He said, you know, in some ways contemplatives can't help themselves. They just can't help themselves. And I feel a bit that way about gay and lesbian people who stay on the road in spite of all this. We stay on the road. It's like we can't help ourselves. What else is there to do? I keep walking. In all of this, the new person is in the darkness, far beyond our control or our conceptualization, thank God, is being formed. T.S. Eliot says, I will wait. I will say to my soul, wait. Wait without hope, because hope would be hope for the wrong thing. Anything we conceptualize or hang on to is not it. So we have to let go and hang on to nothing and just be in the dark. The Holy Spirit is taking over and is leading us in ways we could never imagine. As John of the Cross says, if you want to go to where you are not, you must go by a way in which you are not. The Holy Spirit is doing it in us. We can't do it. We can't travel this terrain, this darkness of desert ourselves. We can't. If we can become receptive and passive in a good sense, the Holy Spirit will lead us in ways we will never understand. Now, I asked you a few moments ago to listen to those points that I enumerated, which are characteristics of the darkness. As a gay and lesbian person, I guarantee you that if you are truly on the journey through, particularly as a religious or a spiritual or in some sense a Christian gay and lesbian person, you have tasted those experiences. You've tasted the old structures falling apart, the religious rituals becoming empty, a sense of powerlessness, finding our compulsions, our addictions, a sense of losing control, the emptiness of religious language and God language, the God you've known disappearing. You felt as if you've been taken out of life, your life is over, it's meaningless, it's empty, aimlessness, as if the whole thing's hopeless, but you've got to keep walking anyway. You've tasted all this. It's already happening in you. This is what I'm saying. This is a path into the dark. This is a path into transformation. If we can walk it vulnerably and openly and with integrity and trust in the God of the darkness, the God we can't see, the God beyond names, who is calling us into this darkness and is with us in the darkness. In fact, not just with us, is the very darkness itself, is all that we are, the very ground of our being. Now, I'm not saying that all gay and lesbian people who are on the track have reached this depth of spiritual maturity. I am saying this is a path. This is a true way into this level of depth, this level of spiritual maturity. Gay and lesbian experience is not something to be shunned, nor is the depth of Christian spirituality. You might note that in one of the first talk of this series, I said that one of the most important principles of the spiritual life is that our spiritual and historical lives are not separate. John of the Cross wrote some of his most wonderful poetry around dark night, around experiencing the God within the darkness, in prison, in torture, in Toledo. These things are not separate. What happens in our spirit, what happens in our external historical lives are enmeshed and feed each other. Similarly, our gay and lesbian experiences feed and lead us into these deeper places if we're open to them. I'd like to say a word now about AIDS. I think that AIDS has become a very, very powerful and profound road into deep and true spirituality. Through all its pain, through all its agony, through all its loss and grief and despair, we hear more and more people talking about the sense of expansion that they feel at the deathbeds of friends. We see incredibly heroic commitment to other people with no reward, with nothing to take away from it except the experience of being with that person in their pain and in their suffering and in their death, in their dying. Matthew Fox says, "It's one thing to be empty. It is an even deeper thing to be emptied." Pain does this. It empties us if we allow it to. This emptiness is what we're coming to through this darkness. And AIDS is one of the great, I hesitate to say gifts because I don't believe that in one sense. I mean, these things are tragedies. They are great catastrophes. The crucifixion was a great catastrophe, a great tragedy. The deaths of tens of thousands of gay men throughout this country, and how many hundreds of thousands of people throughout the world through AIDS, is a great tragedy. But it can become a pathway into this kind of emptiness, darkness, vulnerability and trust. And it's quite clear that it is becoming that for very many people, as we see an extraordinary amount of spirituality, of deep spirituality, hearts opening all over the place, of people who care for people as they die, of people who die as they die themselves. Again, not everyone, but it can be a true pathway, one of the great messages, one of the great learnings for our culture and our church in this time. And thank God there are a few people, I think of Bishop Thomas Gumbleton, for example, who say that the church has to become humble enough and to learn from us in this experience of AIDS about what it means to be emptied and what it means to come to true loving. And he asks us, can we be patient enough with the church to teach the church? That's quite a tall order to ask us. The very fact that you and I are sitting here with these thoughts says that in some way our experience of being gay and lesbian has led us on the path, otherwise we wouldn't be here. And we certainly wouldn't still be listening. I think we would have walked away from this stuff, a long time ago, saying this guy's full of shit. Or maybe I am. Those of you who are still here, I think, know that there's something true in what I'm saying. We've had to go through a lot of pain and darkness. We've had to lose our sense of self. We've had to lose a lot of our sense of who God is, a lot of our sense of morality, most of our sense of morality, a lot of our sense of direction, to find something not based so much on words or concepts or rules or rituals or doctrines. We've been deconstructing the God we've been given, or rather allowing that God to be deconstructed for us, because it's the Holy Spirit who's doing this, and finding our deeper inner sense. At its very best, this deep inner sense is that true law which is written on the heart in love by the Holy Spirit. It's the ground of the soul. It's the God beyond God. It's our true name at our deepest place. I'd like to read a very brief poem that Alan Jones quotes, written by a friend, an anonymous woman, about this process. I will show you the skins I have shed, left in the grass as I crept away. They are proof that I have lived. Skin 1, docile child. Skin 2, obedient adolescent. Skin 3, scholar masked in niceness. Skin 4, stunning career girl. Skin 5, charming child mistress. Skin 6, loving wife. Skin 7, marvellous mother. Skin 8, admirable Christian. Skin 9, heroic saviour of abandoned children. Skin 10, nervous breakdown. Entering the dark. Skinned alive. That's the process we're talking about. In fact, this shedding of the skins was one of the ancient images of going up into the dark mountain of God. Moses taking off his shoes was seen as shedding the skins of the old selves, the old identities, which have to be deconstructed over and over again until we are, after her nervous breakdown, when she enters the dark, after our coming out, our going through the desert, our losing of all we ever thought we had, all we ever thought we were, finding we are skinned alive. Of course, we have all made compromises, and we make them all the time. We're not perfect. It's an ongoing road. But we've had to consciously be with it, and that's our gift, with our inner truth. These compromises we've made, they can be undone. The fact that we're trying to go with our inner truth, trying to be on the path, is the far more crucial thing. If we can allow ourselves to do this over and over again, we can be led by this hidden sense of knowing, this knowing in unknowing, this darkness which the ancient mystics referred to as light which is so brilliant it blinds us. That in fact what is happening is our spirit is being flooded with the uncreated light of the divine itself. And this is so overpowering, we experience it as total darkness, as blindness, as that which undoes everything. But in fact it's the communication of the very life of God. So this inner eye of love will lead us on and on and on. How much I want to say to gay Christians, particularly young gay Christians, don't leave the Christian way. You don't need to. Go into the desert, go into the dark, come out, let yourself be led into the desert and into the dark, and it will teach you everything. I want to say something brief about sex as a teacher. And this is especially true for gay men, not only for gay men, but particularly for gay men in this first point. You don't get through the dark without the most profound receptivity, the most profound emptiness and opening of all that we are. Every layer of being, every single layer of being has to be totally opened, totally receptive, in a sense passive, to allow the action of God in the darkness to be done to us, in us, with us. Now this receptivity and passivity is often characterized as feminine, rightly or wrongly, and gay men get most of our shit from the culture because of our receptivity, our passivity in sex. But folks, this is the very thing we need to learn. The very thing we need to learn, particularly as men. There is the penetrating of the divine, which is perhaps part of what gay women, lesbian women need to learn in their owning their own power. There's the openness and the receiving of the divine, the passivity to the divine, docility to the divine, which we as gay men need to learn. And this also, I believe, needs to be physical. And here is something we can teach other men on the journey of spirituality, what it means to be receptive and open and vulnerable and passive to the divine lover. Sex can teach us this in a very special and unique way. Sex, I think, by following our desires, our fantasies, our needs, our compulsions, our joys, breaks down the old barriers, the old values, the old securities, the old senses of self. It breaks down the old morality. We discover who we are, what's really in there in the dark. We discover the dangers within ourselves. We discover what we could be capable of, and we make friends with it. Right? Or if not friends, at least we make some kind of alliance where we keep it in balance. We gradually come to be at home with all of this of who we are. In peace. This is me. All of this stuff. The good, the bad, the dangerous, the not so good, the beautiful. The issue is that we don't become snared by any of it. We keep moving. The desert nomads kept moving. We continue on the journey. We don't come caught in any of the stuff. But honestly, what can teach us about this stuff the way sex can? It's so available, it's so there. It's what we want to do anyway. If we're open to it, it can really teach us. We have to find inner balance, not through rules and commandments that someone gives us, but in our own bodies, in our own flesh, in our own gutsy, earthy desires, not just in some interior spiritual world. This balance is really at the heart, again, of spirituality, coming to a balance where nothing is denied, everything is accepted, everything is held, everything is let go. Merton says, accepting everything, rejecting nothing. Everything is emptiness, everything is compassion. Being in that place and just holding it all openly and vulnerably and trustingly. So let sex teach us where it can. Again, it's risky, there will be mistakes. We will have dead ends, we'll get stuck. But is that a reason not to make the journey? So, we've gone through a lot. Where does all this lead us? What happens is that gradually, almost without our realizing it, what happens within us is a deeper and deeper surrender, a deeper and deeper letting go on ever deeper levels of our being, of everything, of everything. It's an active surrender. This is not abrogation of responsibilities or anything like that, although that may be called for too sometimes. But it is just a profound and graceful opening up, absolute surrender. We don't need to cling to anything anymore. We just hold it silently, trustingly, in the dark and in the stillness. The still center of silence, the still center surrounded by silence, as Dag Hammarskjöld calls it. We begin to discover, almost to our quiet surprise, that where before there was pain, now there is peace. Nothing dramatic, just quiet peace. The letting go, the losing control, that thing which we've been frightened of so much in our lives, and especially in sex, that everyone's running from, losing control. Now we let go of it. We surrender control. We hand it over more and more gracefully. We accept the not knowing. You know, one of the great ancient mystical treatises says, the more you ascend, the less you understand, because the cloud is dark that lit up the night. This is not some easy knowing. This is a knowing in unknowing, a knowing you can't cling to and hold as my possession. It's a knowing in silence, a knowing beyond knowing. A certain kind of chaos, unpredictability, we let it go, we accept it as part of the human condition. This is what is asked, this is what is given. And this is fundamentally inarticulable. There are no words about this state for this state. One beautiful attempt to say something about it by a monk from Camaldoli down at Big Sur. Faith, when it is authentic, takes me beyond security into a realm where peace may indeed be found, but only in an unmoored drifting into the vast sea of reality. And he gives this beautiful line. I cast the anchor of my life down, and I let its line run deep into the unfathomable God on whose bosom I float. Two certitudes reassure me. The one, it is not madness to be adrift on this sea. The other, I am not alone on this sea. In this inarticulable moment, we also need models. I think of Oscar Romero, the wonderful Archbishop in El Salvador, when he literally stands at the crossroads, having seen his priests murdered, his churches desecrated, himself abused and battered, and one of his priests tortured to death. And he's made the journey from being the good company man, who was the safe archbishop, to being utterly empty. And he stands at the crossroads, dirty and battered, and says, I can't. You must. I'm yours. Show me the way. And from that moment, he's then led into the crucifixion, into the utter surrender of self. And he says then, of course, I will rise in the Salvadoran people, which he does. That's always the promise. And it's at this moment, it's in this darkness, this utter surrender, which can look like despair and yet isn't despair. When we're clinging to nothing, no security, that we have the deepest encounter with God. Doug Hammarskjöld says, the night in Gethsemane, when the last friends left you have fallen asleep, all the others are seeking your downfall, and God is silent as the marriage is consummated. This is when the covenant is made. The people of Israel in the desert become the people of God. In this dark desert, we become the people of God. Let's not run from this desert. Gradually, very simply, one comes to be at home. Very simple. No fireworks. Very simple. At home. The centre begins to emerge, who we truly are. A quiet sense of unity, a gentle light, a place gently to stand. Fragile and weak, but unmistakably there. We come totally empty. Eckhart says, I won't read all of this, but Eckhart says that whenever God finds anything totally empty, God can do nothing but pour himself, utterly and fully into that creature. Because God cannot allow anything or anyone to be totally empty. So our emptiness brings to us the full outpouring of God's self, into our deepest spirit. How can I say all of this? How can I say how this is for a gay man, for a lesbian woman? I don't know. In one sense I can, in one sense I can't. At this place, everything is one. It's not an issue of how do I integrate my gay life with my spiritual life. There is only one life. There is only one ground in our being. There's only one emptiness, one capacity for God. And as a gay man, it's a gay capacity for God. And into that capacity, into that emptiness, God will pour himself, herself. Things to watch out for, just in closing, as we journey through this desert and this darkness. Thinking we've arrived prematurely. Watch it. We could be clinging to something, saying, I've arrived. Despair and neurosis. Neurosis is real. It needs to be dealt with. Deal with it. Getting stuck, circling around in the same spot. Sometimes we need a mentor and a guide to help us with that. Bitterness and cynicism. This is hard stuff. And bitterness and cynicism is one of the real temptations, particularly as we grow older, I think. Grasping for placebos and lollipops, something to make me feel better. Doesn't do too much harm if you don't cling too tightly, but we need to watch it. Over-dramatizing. Oh my God, it's so terrible, it's so awful, I feel so depressed, it's so dark, it's so... let's just be simple about it. On the other hand, we can trivialize our darkness, we can trivialize our pain. No, it's not so bad, what are you complaining about? It is bad, it is painful, it is exile, it is darkness, it is death. In fact, one of the main modern spiritual writers, Ruth Burroughs, says that at this point, it is not too strong a word to say annihilation of the self, of the ego self, not the deep self. Annihilation, this is the journey, the death to self, which all the traditions speak of. Beware of wallowing in misery. Beware of not listening to our own doubts and our own self-questioning, and being aware of listening to them too much. Helps an honest and insightful spiritual companion, someone to talk with and share with, particularly someone who's been on the road a little longer. A healthy sense of humour, ordinary common sense and common ordinary releases and enjoyments. Absolutely crucial. Go and do a hot tub, for God's sake. Have a bottle of wine. Skip meditation and prayer and go and see a movie occasionally. Don't do it all the time. An appreciation of the simple. This process is not a process of ever more complex and esoteric spirituality. Absolutely the opposite. It's a process of utter simplification. As Leonard Bernstein says in his Mass, or Stephen Schwartz who wrote the lyrics, God is the simplest of all. Blessed simplicity. That's the touchstone. And patience, being prepared to wait and wait and wait again. So, as John of the Cross said, O night that guided me more surely than the dawn, night that has united the lover with the beloved. And again, by night we shall go, by night, to seek for the fount of living water. Only our thirst for our guide. Only our thirst for our guide. Blessings on the journey.